lesson is on Reagan's America, the decade of the 1980s. Please review the relevant text references as published in the course calendar that's uploaded to Canvas. We have here recorded insights from the author of the textbook that we're using. You can click on the video icon that's embedded inside of the slide to start the video. Carter was elected in 1976 and was at first deemed a breath of fresh air after what many had deemed the imperial presidency of Richard Nixon. He was, after all, a self-professed born-again Christian, one who proudly professed his evangelical faith with every opportunity that he got. He was, by all accounts, an earnest, decent, and honest man. All of these good qualities notwithstanding, however, he did not have the skill to negotiate the congressional paths of legislation, due in large part to his relative inexperience. The energy bill, for example, that he signed in 1978 bore little resemblance to the one that he had introduced, which reflected the will of special interests. Renewed violence in 1979 in the Middle East led to gas shortages again, and as the prices rose, Carter's approval ratings fell. When Carter came into office, he vowed to pursue a foreign policy that would seek to defend human rights. He had a hard time pursuing this agenda once he discovered that the world did not have a universal standard of what human rights were. No doubt the highlight of his foreign policy achievements was the Camp David Accords of 1978. This was a peace treaty that Carter brokered between Israel and Egypt, in which Egypt recognized Israel's right to exist, and Israel returned to Egypt all the land it had taken in the Sinai Peninsula. Pictured here are the three leaders of the nations that were involved in the Camp David Accords and the leaders who signed the Camp David Accords in September of 1978. Of course, that's Carter in the center, and he's flanked by, on the left, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Ever the humble man, Carter wanted to portray himself as a man of the people, and to that end, he and his wife Rosalind, pictured here, decided to forego the traditional limousine and walk down Pennsylvania Avenue after their inauguration in January of 1977, on a day that was recorded to be one of the coldest on record in Washington, D.C. One of Carter's greatest failures as president, however, was his mismanagement of the economy. When he left office, inflation averaged 13% per year. On top of this, you had a stagnant economy with low growth and high unemployment. These conditions combined to give the world a new vocabulary term, that of stagflation. And although Carter signed the Second Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty in 1978, this was actually a treaty that was negotiated by Gerald Ford. The Iranian Revolution, which erupted in 1979, when fundamentalist Muslims joined to overthrow the pro-American Shah, was the depths of the Carter woes with foreign policy issues. These fundamentalists were led by Ayatollah Khomeini and would take the U.S. Embassy, holding the 52 diplomats and staff as hostages. Carter appealed to the United Nations, but Khomeini refused to listen. The president launched two failed rescue attempts due to helicopter problems. Both of these attempts ended in failure. Eventually, the hostages were released, but only after Carter had been defeated and Reagan had been elected in 1980. Pictured here is an Iranian militant holding a group of U.S. Embassy staff members hostage in Tehran, Iran, where this incident occurred. The hostage crisis and the standoff that ensued lasted a grand total of 444 days, and again only ended on the very morning that Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in January of 1981. The downturn in the economy that had grown worse under Carter and the foreign affair debacle with the Iranian hostage crisis and the failed rescue attempts led Ronald Reagan to win the presidency in 1980 with 9 million votes over Carter and 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. Here is shown the electoral map that shows that Carter only won 4 or 5 states that election year. I mean, it wasn't even close. With an election that convincing, one has to wonder, why was Ronald Reagan such an appealing candidate in 1980? Well, it turns out that something in Reagan's background may have had something to do with this. Reagan had been a movie star before running for governor in California, whereupon he served 2 consecutive terms starting in 1966 and ending in 1974. And for all intents and purposes, he was a fairly popular governor. He ran against Gerald Ford in 1976, but narrowly lost to him in the Republican primary of that year. Additionally, Reagan benefited from a shifting population to Florida, California, and Texas, which changed those states from liberal to conservative. Reagan's chances for the presidency also happened to correspond with the national revival of evangelical Christians. The so-called religious right backed Ronald Reagan, even though Jimmy Carter was a Baptist who openly practiced his faith. Reagan's charismatic persona earned him the nickname the Great Communicator. Another factor in the rebirth of the conservative movement was a reactionary movement of women opposed to the dramatic changes feminists were demanding. Women who relished their roles as homemakers and mothers opposed what they considered to be, quote, a bunch of bitter women seeking a constitutional cure for their personal problems. Conservatism had also become ingrained in the business world in the 1970s due to the issues that compounded the miseries of that time period. Business leaders invested heavily in Reagan's campaign in response. The rise of the religious right saw protests against the Supreme Court ruling that reinforced the separation of church and state. From an economic standpoint, Reagan was similarly very conservative. Believing that government was not the solution to the economic malaise affecting the United States, but rather the problem itself, Reagan pushed through a series of bills that cut income taxes and capital gain taxes and made other concessions to revitalize the population. By doing so, he returned money to the richest Americans, who then had more to spend on items. The idea was that this would increase demand, which would create jobs and would cause unemployment to lessen and increase the amount in tax coffers. This is known as supply-side or trickle-down economics, but observers and critics of this theory refer to it simply as Reaganomics. In addition to this tax and spend policy, if you will, the federal government's budget was cut in areas that were deemed not for the truly needy. This would cause the most vulnerable in America's population, particularly poor children and the elderly, to suffer disproportionately. Here we see a throng of more than 5,000 senior citizens staging a demonstration in downtown Detroit, railing against Reagan's decision to make cuts in Social Security and other federal programs supporting the elderly. This picture was taken in 1982, halfway through Reagan's first term in office. During his first term in office, scandals erupted in his administration, resulting in over 200 of his appointees being accused of unethical or illegal activities. However, Reagan seemingly remained untouched by these developments. In 1981, Reagan's anti-liberalism was put on keen display. The Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATCO, went on strike, which was against federal law. Reagan fired all of the members of this union and provided replacements from the military. That same year, he named Sandra Day O'Connor to be the first woman appointee on the Supreme Court. The 1984 election was an even more decisive victory for Reagan than even his 1980 election had been. Reagan carried 49 of the 50 states and soundly defeated his Democratic opponent that year, Walter Mondale from Minnesota, which was the only state, incidentally, that didn't go for Reagan. With the economy revitalized, the Republicans renominated him for a second term. The Democrats nominated Carter's vice president, Walter Mondale, who nominated Geraldine Ferraro for vice president. Reagan won 59% of the vote. Using his election as a mandate to continue his previous term's goals, Reagan signed the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which reduced the number of tax brackets and lowered tax rates once again. Throughout his presidency, Reagan charged that most of the trouble in the world politically lay at the hands of the Soviet Union and Moscow. Labeling the Soviets a, quote, evil empire, he initiated a dramatic buildup of nuclear conventional weapons and announced the creation of something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based anti-weapons platform. Closer to home, Central America was rife with communist activity, such as in El Salvador, where communist-supported forces had been attempting to overthrow the elected government since the year 1980. Reagan dispatched military advisors and funds to prevent the overthrow of the government. However, this did not have the intended effect, as the revolutionaries used this to their advantage and won control of the nation. In Nicaragua, Reagan empowered the Central Intelligence Agency to train and supply anti-communist rebels to fight against the Soviet and Cuban armed government, which itself had come to power by overthrowing the previous dictator. There are two short clips related to the Strategic Defense Initiative mentioned on the previous slide. The video in the top left-hand corner is one of Reagan himself announcing his SDI initiative or his program in a press conference in 1982. And then the video that you see located in the lower right-hand corner is a brief explanatory video that someone did that kind of puts it all in perspective and into context. There were hot spots in other parts of the world during Reagan's presidency as well. The Middle East was racked by an Islamic civil war between the nations of Iran and Iraq. Afghanistan had been invaded by the Soviets, who were becoming increasingly bogged down in their own version of Vietnam. Israeli troops pushed the Palestinian Liberation Organization's forces, also known as the PLO, from nearby Lebanon, and U.S. troops were sent in as peacekeepers. In October 1983, an Islamic suicide bomber killed 241 American Marines, leading Reagan to withdraw all forces from the area. Also, in 1983, Reagan responded to pleas from the neighboring nation of Grenada to depose a communist government there that had overthrown the previous regime. Once again, the Marines were sent in, and in a lopsided battle, the United States was victorious. During his last 2 years in office, Reagan started to face increasing opposition from Congress. Reports began circulating about illicit arms sales to Iran in exchange for Iran working to secure American hostages in Lebanon, which went against an earlier pledge that Reagan had issued stating that he did not negotiate with terrorists. Money from these sales, in turn, were used to fund the Contra forces fighting in Nicaragua. All of this was done without the knowledge of Congress or without their say-so. Eventually, the charges were proven true, and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, aide to the National Security Council, was discovered as the ringleader of this plan. Further investigation proved that members of Reagan's administration had also known about the plan, including Admiral John Poindexter, pictured here. North was fired, and he was convicted, but his judgment was overturned on an appeal. In 1988, the Nicaraguan president, Daniel Ortega, negotiated a ceasefire with the Contras. And something briefly touched on in our Cold War presentation, under the new Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev, the Russians pursued détente to focus on their own domestic problems. Gorbachev met with Reagan in 1987 and signed a treaty that caused both sides to reduce the number of nuclear warheads they both had in their possession. This was a triumphant stance for Ronald Reagan, who is widely credited for hastening the end of the Cold War. There were very significant changes here at home during Reagan's term in office. The invention of the silicon chip in 1971 led to the computer age. Led by Bill Gates and Ed Roberts, the personal computer revolution transformed the marketplace and the economy. During Reagan's administration, the federal debt tripled. Savings among Americans were at an all-time low, and on October 1987, the stock market crashed. Although it was worse than the 1929 crash, automatic safeguards enacted since then prevented the worst from coming. The government had given up on building new public housing for low-income families, and urban renewal programs were not required to locate new homes for those whom it displaced. As a result, the number of homeless rose during the 1980s. In addition, the discovery of acquired immune deficiency syndrome, also known as AIDS, brought to the forefront of society the risk of unprotected homosexual relations and drug use. Originally thought of as a gay disease, AIDS emerged as one of the nation's greatest healthcare problems, and because of Reagan's inherent conservatism, Reagan himself refused to make any public statement with regards to this new epidemic until 1987, 7 years after the disease itself was well in hand. Here is an image of a 1980s era advertisement for a first generation Mac. Apple, of course, was a company founded by Steve Jobs. And again, the personal computing revolution of the 1980s changed forever how we did business, how we lived, and how we worked. This picture captures some of the emotions that occurred during so-called Black Monday, which was October 19th, 1987. We see a frenzied trader calling for attention in the pit of the Chicago Board Options Exchange as the Dow Jones stock average lost over 500 points in a single day. Here are members of the influential AIDS activity group ACT UP during a protest in New Orleans where President Reagan was scheduled to speak in 1988. As stated earlier, under the new Soviet premier Mikhail Gorbachev, the Russians pursued détente to focus on their own domestic problems. Gorbachev met with Reagan and signed a treaty that caused both sides to reduce the number of nuclear warheads they had in their possession. During his administration, Reagan was able to redefine the role of government and promote a more active engagement with the Soviets in an attempt to win or at least end the Cold War. In the election of 1988, Republicans would nominate George Herbert Walker Bush, Reagan's vice president, to be their candidate in the general election that year. The Democrats nominated Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis as their candidate. A series of mishaps and political blunders marred the Democratic campaign, and Bush would win the election with 426 electoral votes. Again, the map as it's displayed here shows an election that wasn't even close. Bush's biggest domestic problem was the size of the national debt, which had grown 3 times what it had been in 1980, the combined effect of massive tax cuts and massive increases in military spending. He also waged war on illegal drugs, appointing William Bennett as drug czar. In communist nations that lacked a strong leader to hold the system together, revolutionary movements took root. Eastern Europe held the first of these nations to break free from communist oppression. During Bush's administration, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, Hungary, and eventually East Germany ended their relationship with the USSR. Although he was globally popular, Mikhail Gorbachev faced a coup back home and was removed from power. He was replaced by Boris Yeltsin. Bush and Yeltsin would agree to a dramatic reduction in the numbers of nuclear stockpiles before the Soviet Union eventually collapsed in 1991. Also, as previously mentioned in the Cold War presentation a bit earlier, here we see a West German demonstrator pounding away at the Berlin Wall on November 11th, 1989, while East German border guards look on, something that would not have happened just 1 month earlier. Other foreign policy highlights of Bush the first's terms in office was when he sent troops into Panama in 1989 to overthrow Manuel Noriega. In 1983, Noriega had taken the de facto leadership position of Panama, which allowed him to use his connections to run drugs and arms into the United States. Within a day, in a military operation deemed Operation Just Cause, Noriega had been captured. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces invaded Kuwait. Bush sent troops into Saudi Arabia to defend that nation from a similar attack. After deadlines expired in 1991, a coalition force, or a coalition of the willing as they were called, made up of 30 nations, attacked Iraq and drove it out of Kuwait. After 6 weeks of fighting, the war ended. And here's an image of Allied soldiers patrolling the southern Iraqi town of Salaman on February 27, 1991. Now, of course, this will not mark the end, but merely the beginning of our misadventures or adventures in the country of Iraq, a story that, even as we speak, is still unfolding. So this concludes the lecture PowerPoint presentation for this lesson. Please consult the course calendar in Canvas for relevant text references.